Today, we've got a small episode. It's about being small. Can't wait for you to join me.
It's time for another show from Colin Jones, the Reasonable Adventurer. Time for you to take another step towards creating your own opportunities for satisfaction.
And it is a small welcome to episode 107 of the Reasonable Adventurer. It's great to be with you. Today I want to talk to you about believing that small is beautiful. It's not an easy thing to do. We live in a world where bigger seems to be better, right? Everything around us seems to be aggregating up. It's almost like the small things don't matter. Think about your childhood. Think about 30, 40 years ago when you could get so much pleasure from small things. The small store down the street, right? Your imagination, your ability to just amuse yourself with something small. Now it all has to be bigger and better. I'm facing an interesting challenge, I suspect, at my work with this notion of chunking. We've got to try and find a way to get everybody to be on the same page when it comes to chunking their work. So we predominantly teach online. We've got to try and make sure that we're not overloading our students, giving them too much content, and making sure that there's a nice structured way to the way we put that information together so that it can be absorbed, understood, used before we move on and start working with new information or integrating past information. And it's most likely going to be a challenge for many people, all stakeholders, not just those at the front doing the teaching, but the people in my role looking to help people to actually understand the challenges involved here. And I go back to 2003 when I was sitting in a conference presentation, and I was listening to a presentation that was related to philosophy of entrepreneurship education. And it was delving into a lot of areas that I found really fascinating, that I hadn't thought of, and so I was really new to this space. One of the books that I was introduced to was Alfred Whitehead's The Aims of Education and Other Essays. And as I've discussed in the show many times, this has become a very, very influential book for me. I went to the library, I picked up that book. As soon as I started reading it, I thought, wow, someone nearly 100 years ago knew that I needed this book and they wrote it. Fantastic, it's just what I wanted to read. Did you hear what I just said then? It's just what I wanted to read. We need to find ourselves in past literature to help us develop a sense of why we have the teaching philosophy we have. Even if we haven't recognized one, we have one, okay? Otherwise, why do we do what we do, right? There must be some madness that drives the way we organize ourselves and approach our process as being a teacher. As I read through Whitehead, the things that were jumping off the page, less is more. Wow. I saw that, and I was sort of already embroiled in this. If it's about experiential learning, why have we got all this content? This wrestle was already occurring. And the institutional norm was, it's safe. Get a good textbook, a big thick one. It's safe. You can't go too wrong if you're doing that. Well, I was obviously looking at the developmental aspect of people's skills, abilities, confidence, not just could they remember some knowledge for an exam. And so this idea that less is more really jumped off the pages at me. And he went on to talk about the danger of inert ideas. Whitehead expressed that every true revolution that's ever stirred in education has been a protest against inert ideas. That really jumped off the page for me too. I started thinking to myself, wow, this is pretty cool. So what's he saying here? If the information really doesn't add to the primary outcomes we're trying to achieve, let's get rid of it. Let's not just have filler information. Let's have the information that really matters. And then he argued that once we work out what that information is, then our students have to learn that in their here and now, backwards, forwards, inside out, every possible way, so that they don't just remember something, they know it. It is committed to that long-term memory. We're going to come back and talk about that at the end of the show. So, as I walk into this chunking challenge that's looming on my immediate horizon, one of the funny things that sort of dawns on me as somebody who embraced believing that small is beautiful nearly 20 years ago, and someone who most probably in my current teaching life would never have needed to worry about chunking, because I'm fighting another war, which is, why do you not have more content to give your students, right? So most probably the other extreme end of this situation. It sort of brings me back to thinking about those educators, those scholars who have been able to do a lot with a small amount of words. And I looked at my shelves this morning and I thought, okay, what have I got here that really stands out, that really has made an impact, that I use constantly in a day-to-day basis, but doesn't go over 100 pages? So there's a question for you. How many books have you got on your shelves, scholarly books, that are truly impactful, less than 100 pages? I've got a stack. I start with Dewey, Interest and Effort. It's about 95 pages, but if that includes all of the forward material. And when you think about the big idea in that book, I mean, I posted it on Twitter this morning. I mean, if we can increase the students' interest in the focus of what our education is focused on, we can increase their effort. So it's not, can we make something we like more interesting to them? Can we bring their level of natural interest into the classroom learning situation? So that's a big idea, big idea. And I think by my calculation this morning, about 17,000 words, that book. If you went to a publisher at the moment with a book proposal for 17,000 words, they wouldn't get too excited by what you're putting forward. Then I look at a few years later, Dewey brought out Experience and Education. That's even smaller. That's mostly, depending on the version you've got, but it's mostly about 75 pages. And even then, if it was printed today, that might equate to 40 or 50 pages. But how big are the ideas in that small book? Education can be educative, miseducative, uneducative. And everything we do exists along this principle of continuity, of experience. So the podcast show I'm doing today is somehow influenced by the podcast shows I've done in the past. And maybe what I'm doing today will have an influence on episode 108. And so by understanding the influence and the centrality of experience in education, Julia was able to take us a long way, a long way, in a very small book, Then move on to Ralph Tyler. And I think it's one of those books that sort of sits behind everything else. You know, if you're familiar with constructive alignment, then you are very familiar with the ideas of Ralph Tyler. Ralph Tyler was a luminary. He was a fantastic educator, but most probably at a time when we had Dewey before him and we had other people coming after him, and he had his moment where his work stood up, and it's mostly faded away from the limelight now. But if you read John Biggs's work on constructive alignment, you are reading Ralph Tyler's thinking. Now, in his most celebrated book, 1949, the Basic Principles of Curriculum and Instruction, he had this beautiful idea on educational outcomes, that they can be either set by us as educators, working through what do we think are the general needs of our students, i.e. next year's class, what do they need to know, versus what might be the immediate needs of the students we haven't yet met. So how might we arrange the curriculum, and dare I say it, in pedagogical fashion, so that we're actually able to respond and support the exploration of those immediate needs that students have, something very common in entrepreneurship and I would argue in lots of other areas. We have someone like R.D. Laing and his brilliant book, Knots. It's only 70 pages, and if you take out the front matter, maybe it's 50 pages. He has this lovely little poem. I'm not sure if to call it a poem, but lovely little set of words here. I'll read them to you. It's a beauty, because it's a constant problem when we're thinking about chunking, when we're thinking about our students, when we're thinking about anybody who faces a new horizon of learning. He says, he does not think there is anything the matter with him because one of the things that is the matter with him is that he does not think there is anything the matter with him. Therefore, we have to help him realize that the fact that he does not think there is anything the matter with him is the thing that is the matter with him. Beautiful. I wish if I get to the end of my life and I manage to write a passage of words like that, maybe I'll just retire to wherever I'm going to end up, feeling pretty satisfied with my life. I also bought this little book the other day, and I must admit, I didn't realise it was going to be so small. It's the smallest book I own. It's 5 inches by 5 inches. But it's a brilliant book. It's called The Best of the Best Classroom Guides by Isabella Wallace and Leah Kirkman. And it's a fascinating little book because it's got the best of the best. You've got your John Hattie's, your Jeff Petty's. They're all there. Everybody's in this book. It's fantastic, right? And one of the really neat things, when I looked at the little chapter, the mini chapter in here by Jeff Petty, who I'm sure is known to many of you, was he just talked about this challenge of when we think about what are best practice, they tend to always relate to one thing, and that is teacher is doing less, students are doing more. Whatever the technique, whatever the approach. And then the challenge is when we test those methods, those approaches, are we actually doing them the right way? So it's easy to sort of say, well, someone says we should do this to have better outcomes. But whatever that prescribed method is, are we actually doing it the right way, right? It's easy to measure bad practice and say it doesn't have an impact on what we're trying to do. So that is definitely a really cool book to get hold of because it just keeps reminding us of simple little things, small pearls of wisdom which we can carry with us as we go forward. And then I think in the last couple of shows I mentioned to you my admiration for Eric Hoffer in his book Reflections of the Human Condition. Again, less than 100 pages, very small book, and just full of sentences and mini paragraphs. No, nothing that goes beyond maybe 8 or 10 lines before that's it. We move on to the next issue. It's brilliant. And I'll read you one of the little sentences that's in this book. I love it. People who cannot grow want to leap. They want shortcuts to fame, fortune, and happiness. So that's interesting, isn't it? We want to get into this chunking process. It's not going to be easy. For a lot of people, it's not going to be easy at all. But if you want the fame, if you want the fortune, if you want to be successful in this space, then you're going to have to grow. That's the only way to do it. And that growth might be an uncomfortable process for us. So, what am I going to be focused on as I move into this space? There's lots of different things we can pick up on. There's a nice little book, series of books by James Lang that I've come across recently, Small Teaching. I really like that. How do we make little changes to what we're doing, and how do they cumulatively add up? We can think about this in a face-to-face context, and we can also think about his work in a digital learning context as well. Well, I'm going to try and bring the conversations back to cognitive load theory. For me, that's the space where I think the logic of what underpins chunking rests on. It's not about it being a prioritised area of action. It's not about it being a institutional policy. For me, it's about what is good learning. What do we know from cognitive load theory? Well, we know that our long-term memories, unlimited capacity to store information. You couldn't write it all down. If there was a way of you writing down everything that you can remember, your life would have expired well before you had a chance to write down everything you could remember. Conversely, we know that our working memory is extremely limited and very easy to overload. We also know for that long-term memory to work in our favour, there needs to be a schema. There needs to be mechanisms that enable us to recall information at the right time for the right reasons and to be able to apply it in the right ways. So, if we can accept that learning happens when we successfully transfer new information from our working memory into our long-term memory, then we need to embrace chunking because it's central to making our world smaller, and it's central to making sure that we can teach in a way that maximises the learning potential of our students. So, nice small show today. I hope I've given you something to reflect on. I look forward to talking to you next week. Cheers.